Good morning, everyone. Another beautiful day in paradise. Isn't it great? Before I get started today, this is my last lecture, and I've got to tell you this story. A senior citizen rolled out of a Chevrolet dealership in Florida in a brand new Corvette. He got on I-95 and floored it, and he was going 80 miles an hour, and the wind was blowing through what little hair he had left. And he was enjoying himself, and all of a sudden, the lights in the rearview mirror came on, and he was being trailed by a highway patrolman. He pushed it up to 90 miles an hour, 100, 110. And then he said, "What am I doing? I'm too old for this." So he pulled the car over to the side of the road. The highway patrolman walked up to him and looked at his watch and said, "Sir, I get off shift in 30 minutes. It's Friday afternoon. If you can give me a reason that I've never heard before for going as fast as you were, I'll let you off free." The senior citizen said, "Well, sir, 10 years ago my wife ran away with a highway patrolman. And I thought you were bringing her back." Okay. All right, let's get started. In the 13th century, in an obscure valley of Cusco in Peru, an Inca dynasty arose that through intimidation, through bribery, through gifts, and so forth, were able to overcome their rivals and create the largest pre-Columbian empire in the New World, the Inca dynasty. By the way, that's my email address. If you have any questions after the cruise is over, feel free to send me an email. I'll be happy to communicate with you. We've already talked about two of these civilizations, the Maya in 1500 BC to 1500 AD, 3,000-year period. The Aztecs, a relatively short period of a little bit less than 100 years. The third civilization is the Inca civilization. It's really a remarkable coincidence that the Incas existed at exactly just a 10-year difference approximately, at the same time as the Aztecs. They arose at the same time, and they fell at approximately the same time. A remarkable coincidence. These are the Inca rulers. In fact, they called the emperors Inca. That was the title of the emperors. And as you can see, there were a number of them. We don't know exactly when some of them were reigning. I will be talking about Pachacuti and Atahualpa a little bit more, but the rest of them, time does not permit a discussion of them. The succession of power in the Inca dynasty wasn't as clear-cut as the European model, where a crown prince would succeed to the throne when the king or the queen died. In the Inca Empire, the new Inca, the new ruler, was a male of the royal bloodline who was judged the most fit for office by his peers. So as you can imagine, that opened the opportunity for a lot of infighting, competition, assassinations, civil war. So the transition from one Inca to another was often a time of great turmoil and bloodshed. Interesting the way they treated their deceased rulers. They mummified them. They believed that they were in a different stage of life, but they were still on the earth. And so those mummified remains were living on their old estates that they lived on when they were alive. They were fed and clothed. Anytime a major matter of importance was needed, a decision needed to be made, they were consulted. And in fact, they went to visit other mummies and also living people. That must have been a very interesting thing to observe. Pachacuti, the name Pachacuti means earth shaker in the Inca language. He was the one who started the building of the empire. He was really the father of the empire. He codified the Inca laws, in effect set up a constitution, put in place a taxation system that consisted of agricultural production, textile production, and service to the state. And I'll be talking a little bit more about that as we progress throughout this particular talk. And through strategic alliances, marriages, and military raids, he started the expansion of the Inca Empire. Basically, he would send spies to the surrounding regions. And having gathered as much intelligence as possible, he would then seek to bribe the rulers. He would give them very valuable gifts. He would try to help them to understand that if they became part of the Inca Empire, subject to his control, they would have wealth far greater than if they continued to exist independently. And that worked most of the time. Some of the time it didn't. And then war was necessary. And the Incas were great warriors. They did have copper and brass weapons, unlike the Maya, unlike the Aztecs. And they, on occasion, whenever necessary, they could raise an army of 140,000 soldiers to march against any of these rivals who had not succumbed to their bribes. This is Cusco right here. That was where Pachacuti, where his headquarters was. These other colored areas were other civilizations that were contemporaneous with the Incas. And over a relatively rapid period of time, as you can see, 1439 to 1533, the Inca Empire expanded from Cusco all the way up to inside current-day Colombia and down into Chile and Argentina. It also included parts of Bolivia as well. And so it expanded very, very quickly over that relatively short period of time. It was such a large region, over 3,000 miles from the border to the north to the border at the south, that for administrative purposes, they divided it up into 4 regions. The word suyu means region in the Inca language. Northern region, western, eastern, and southern region. And you'll notice they all came together at one point. And that point was Cusco, the capital of the Inca Empire. Pachacuti created a ceremonial center, a place of residence for nobility and royalty, and it was laid out in the form of a puma. He was, again, very, very tied into spiritual things, and the puma is a sacred animal in the mythology of the Inca. This is the current-day Plaza de Armas, or Playa Mayor, of Cusco, and all of the 4 regions touched there. That was the center point of the empire. And by the way, they believed that Cusco was the navel of the world. It was the very, very center of the world, and the center of Cusco was the Playa de Armas. So we call it the Playa de Armas today, Playa de Huacaypata back then. And this is a picture of the Plaza de Armas today. Right there in the center of that plaza is where the center of the Inca Empire was located. Now, in order to enable the governance, the commerce, and so forth of such a large area, they needed a very extensive road system. And so from Quito, Ecuador, to the north, to Mendoza, Argentina, in the south, 3,700 miles of highway ran along the spine of the Andes, as well as along the coastline as well. There was a whole network of roads. More than 25,000 miles in total of roads, and many of them are still in existence today. The roads ran as high as 16,000 feet above sea level. They were 3 to 13 feet in width. The highway itself was restricted to only people who were engaged in the imperial business. You could not travel from one town to another if you wanted to visit relatives unless you got special permission to do so. Of course, there were many chasms that had to be crossed, and they had to build bridges. Many of them were rope bridges. And those bridges, of course, deteriorate fairly quickly. And so it was necessary to repair them frequently. They had to virtually rebuild the bridge every year. And you can see individuals doing that in the picture in the lower right-hand corner. In fact, there would always be a village next to the bridge, and the only purpose of that village was to house the people who would continually maintain that bridge. The roads were used for rapid communication. They had a runner system, sort of like the Pony Express in the Old West, except these were men, young men usually, who lived locally. They were called the Chasqui. About every mile there would be a station where they would wait, and in effect it was sort of like a relay race. And they could take a message, or lightweight luxury goods. They hauled those on their back. They could go 150 miles in one day. That was the most rapid means of communication and transportation in the world at that point in time. Now, of course, the roads were also used to move the Inca army whenever it needed to attack a rival nation. And I know that some of us ran into some major traffic backlogs in Panama City. Well, it was almost as bad in some of these narrow locations where large armies of maybe 35,000 people, and of course all of the camp followers and the llamas and so forth, had to pass through that bottleneck. It would take days in order to move that whole army through that choke point. The roads were used for the distribution of resources. You can see they're still being used today. A little bit about the Inca economy. They did not have a market system. We talked about the market in Tenochtitlan, where 25,000 people would come and there'd be all kinds of commerce and business. No such thing in the Inca Empire. No money, no currency, no trading class either in the Inca society. It was one of the most purely socialistic nations in the history of the world. Everything was owned by the ruling elite. Individual families only had the use of things that they needed to survive. The government controlled the production, distribution, and use of all of the commodities. Now, there were two categories of commodities that I'd like to talk about: luxury items and staples. First of all, luxury items. These luxury items were reserved for the elite. They were used to pay the various officials in the far-flung regions of the empire. They were used to bribe rivals to get them to join the empire. The luxury items consisted of gold and silver and cups and jewelry and so forth. These shells right here are called spondylus shells. They were highly valued, even more than gold in some respects. They were available in the deep water off the coast of Ecuador. So one of the major efforts of providing luxury items was the bringing up from the deep water off of Ecuador these shells. And then they were used for the creation of jewelry and so forth. Feathered items as well were highly valued. But among the most valued of the luxury items were the textiles. The tunics that were created were only to be worn by nobility. You could not wear the really nice textiles unless you were part of the royal family. Textile production was something that many people, if not most of the people in the Inca Empire, were involved with in terms of the processing of the cotton. The alpacas provided the special, very fine kind of wool, and they were woven into fabrics of extreme beauty. In fact, the Inca art is reflected in their textiles, not in pottery, not in paintings, in their textiles. And you're going to see some really beautiful textiles, I believe, when we reach Peru. And this is an individual today in Peru with a backstrap loom. You can hardly see it, but there's a strap that goes around her back. She leans back, that causes it to become taut, and then she is able to weave those threads together into a beautiful textile. The length of that is not, there's no limit to it really, as long as she can lean back far enough and make it taut. The width of it, however, is only the width of her reach, and so it can only be a certain width. Gregory, where are you? Okay, Gregory, would you stand up? I have an assistant with me today. Gregory is, notice the hat. Some of the women wear hats like that, but the men wear hats like Gregory has on. So you may want to talk to him. Greg, turn around and do a model that for us. Thank you very much. Appreciate that. All right, Greg. Thank you very much. Okay. So textiles were very, very important. Now, with all of these commodities flowing around, the luxury items and the staple items, they needed to have some kind of way of keeping track of things. And they did that with quipus. Quipu is the Inca word for knot. And they had these knotted strings that were the written records, written quote unquote, the quantitative records of censuses, of harvests, of inventory of items. And based on the number of turns in a knot, the color and direction of the twist of the string, whether or not it was attached to the top or bottom of the main cord, that told them all they needed to know about that particular, whatever it was that they were counting. It's really quite remarkable. I don't think that we have broken the code for the quipus as much as perhaps we broke the code for the glyphs of the Maya. Unfortunately, the individuals who could have explained it were killed or died off before that information was passed on. So the quipu, if you were a CPA in the Inca Empire, you were an expert in quipus. Now, I mentioned luxury items as one major category of commodity. The others the other classification were staples, of course. Food, tools, raw materials, and such. And the people, in effect, were taxed. They had to provide a certain amount of food or tools or raw materials. And those surplus commodities were then stored in state warehouses. And then those, in effect, became areas of distribution. If your family needed a certain amount of food, the harvest wasn't going very well, you could go to the nearest storehouse and get whatever you needed there. So there were storehouses or warehouses all over the country, and you will see them. Some of them are circular buildings, such as you see here. Some of them are square buildings. They still exist today, dotting the countryside. They were everywhere. After all, wherever the people were, there had to be a storehouse to support that center of population. And the quote at the bottom here is from one of the Spanish conquistadores. There are storehouses full of textiles, wool, arms, metal, and clothes, and of all things grown and made in their land. Up on the high on the side of the mountain, you'll find warehouses as well. In terms of the crops that the Inca grew, you can see them listed here: nuts and fruits and vegetables, roots, legumes, and grains. Some of these we recognize, such as walnuts and papayas and peppers, squash, quinoa, a very healthy form of grain, and we've already talked about potatoes a little bit when I gave the What If lecture earlier in this cruise. Potatoes were the main staple crop for the Incas. They grew more than 200 varieties of them. They originated in the territory just between Cusco and the current day border of Bolivia, so approximately here. A very, very important staple crop. They were able to process them by stepping on them and squashing them and then drying them. That product was called chuño. And here's a picture of it right here. Chuño could be stored for 10 years in a dry, cool environment. So this was a crop that enabled them to make it through times of famine, times of shortage. Very, very nutritional, as you'll recall from my What If lecture earlier in the cruise. Now, a discussion of what they grew would not be complete without talking about coca. Today, you will see Peruvians with what looks like a chew of tobacco in their cheek. It's probably coca leaves. It's a very mild stimulant with the effect comparable to, say, a cup of coffee. And the Incas revered coca as sacred and magical, even though it did have beneficial properties such as lessening hunger and pain. They primarily used it for religious purposes. It's totally legal to grow cocaine for your own, not cocaine. Whoops, Freudian slip there. To grow coca for your personal use, and you'll see it traded as well. It is not addictive, just chewing the leaves. Now, think about this part of the world. There aren't long rolling prairies. It's a lot of up and down. And other than the valley floor, they had to find other ways to grow their foods. And so they terraced these steep hillsides. And as you go through rural Peru, you will still see these terraces in existence today, and they are still being used by the local population. They would create a terrace by laying a foundation of solid rock, and then another layer, or actually a couple of layers, one of gravel and one of sand, and then finally they'd put the topsoil on top. Now, as you can imagine, that would be a very fruitful way to grow crops as long as there was a source of water. And so they created an amazing system of aqueducts. Aqueducts would go for miles, and the incline was just perfect so that water could be transported from high altitude springs down to the terraces and down to the urban areas. And so you will see aqueducts all over the country. Amazing what they were able to do. They were great engineers. Now, in terms of animals, we talked about the 4 domesticated animals of the Maya: the turkey, the Muscovy duck, the dog, and doves. The Inca had 3. So the grand total of domesticated animals in the entire New World was 7. The 3 animals that the Inca had were guinea pigs, alpaca, and llamas. Now, guinea pigs, aren't they cute? They are grown for food. The Joyce Middlebrook, one of our great friends here on the cruise, told us about her experience eating cuyo. C-U-Y-O is what it's called. You'll see it on menus. It's a very dark, stringy, sort of fishy tasting chicken. And so even if you could even begin to think about eating one of those cute creatures, it's not worth it, really. The alpaca grew a very fine wool. They weighed about 150 pounds, and so they were a good source of wool for the textiles. Llama weighed about 400 pounds. Their wool was really very coarse, but still could be used for the lower class kinds of textiles. But the llamas were so important. They were the only draft animal in the New World. They could carry up to 70 pounds on their backs. And so they were part of the army. In fact, since they could be eaten for animal protein, they could be used to carry military supplies, and their leather, the leather made from their skin, as well as the wool from their hair, it was in effect the jeep, K-ration, and fatigues of the Inca army. They were marvelous animals to have in support of an army. The Inca religion. The Maya had 160 gods. The Aztecs had 1,600. The Incas didn't have nearly as many, but as you can see, they focused on the natural world. These are the major gods. I don't know that there were that many more than what you see here. The primary god being the sun god, Inti. And I'll talk a little bit more about Inti in just a few moments. In terms of their faith system, their religion, it was a fairly simple code. They didn't have 10 commandments, they had 3. Do not steal, do not lie, and don't be lazy. They believed that people who were obedient to that code would go to live in the sun's warmth after they passed away, and everyone else who broke the commandments were going to be consigned to the cold earth. So certainly everyone tried to obey those commandments. Human sacrifice was very, very rare among the Inca, much, much more rare than among the Maya and the Aztecs. But they would use children primarily for that purpose because they were so pure and undefiled. And they would sacrifice teenagers and young children to Inti, the sun god. The tops of mountains were considered to be the most sacred places in the empire. And so those sacrifices would take place on those mountain tops, way, way high, very, very close to the very summit of the mountains. And on this particular mountain in northwestern Argentina, explorers found the mummified body of a 15-year-old girl. Her skin was perfectly preserved because of the cold temperatures and the very dry aspect of the atmosphere. And so she looked like she had just gone to sleep the day before she was found. Francisco Pizarro. We always get around to the Spanish, don't we? He was the mayor of Panama Viejo before Morgan came along and destroyed it. He was a very ambitious mayor, and he had heard rumors of an empire to the south that had plenty of gold and silver. And of course, that's all the Spaniards need to hear before they saddled up and went to investigate. And so he embarked on a number of expeditions to determine what could be found to the south. In 1524, he had a very short, sort of aborted expedition. They got as far as current day, halfway down the coast of current day Colombia. They were running out of food. They weren't well provisioned. A number of them starved to death, and they went back to Panama Viejo. In 1526, just a couple of years later, he embarked on another expedition. This man was not to be deterred. And they sailed down the coast much farther than the first time. When they reached Tumbes, many of the sailors and soldiers were, hey, let's go back to Panama. This is getting us nowhere. They hadn't found any gold or anything. And so Pizarro drew a line on the sand and said, friends and comrades, on that side, pointing to the south, are toil, hunger, nakedness, and drenching storm, desertion and death. On this side, meaning the Panama side, ease and pleasure. Choose each man what best becomes a brave Castilian. And he stepped across the line. And out of his more than 100 followers, only 16 people stepped across the line with him. Apparently they weren't terribly inspired at that point. They wanted to head back to Panama. Enough of this exploration business. You mean after such an inspiring speech? Apparently it didn't work very well. But he continued on. Many of his people turned back to Panama. He continued on. And as fate would have it, his ship encountered a royal coastal vessel that was taking luxury goods from one part of the empire to another. Gold, silver, beautiful textiles, all of the things of great value. And they were able to capture that and take those luxury items back to Panama. And based on that evidence, Pizarro went to the King of Spain and said, I need for your support for another expedition down. As you can see, there are some things there of great value. And so it was, a couple of years later, his third expedition in 1531. This time he went inland. He had heard that the emperor of the Inca Empire was in Cajamarca at that point in time. There had been a civil war. Again, remember I talked about how messy the transition of power was in the Inca Empire. Well, apparently there had been a civil war. Well, before I say that, his expedition was 62 horsemen and 106 foot soldiers, not the 400 that Cortez had in Mexico. So only keep those numbers in mind, 106 foot soldiers, 62 horsemen. They found Atahualpa resting at Cajamarca with his army of 80,000 warriors. The Spanish attacked, took them by surprise, captured Atahualpa, and held him for ransom. Atahualpa said, "The room that I'm in I will fill with gold, and then I will give you much silver as well." And so the word went out throughout the empire, send your gold and silver to Cajamarca. And more than 24 tons of gold and silver were delivered. Now, you recall what happened to Montezuma after he had been captured and ransoms paid and so forth? Well, the Spaniards decided that Atahualpa needed to leave this existence. And so Pizarro staged a mock trial, found him guilty of revolting against Spain, practicing idolatry, and murdering his brother, and sentenced him to die by burning. Now this was absolute anathema for the Inca, because they believed that if a body was burned, there was no afterlife. So Atahualpa pleaded with Pizarro not to burn him to death. He even promised to be converted to the religion of the conquistadores so that he might have his sentence commuted. He was converted, and in fact Pizarro gave him his name, Pizarro Atahualpa. That was his new Christian name. And then he proceeded to murder him by strangulation. These were people that are not very pleasant. So that was really the end of the Inca Empire. There, of course, was a puppet ruler that the Spaniards put in power, and there were a number of wars and battles over succeeding years, but when Atahualpa was killed, that, generally speaking, was the de facto end of the Inca Empire. And so now we're going to sort of take a quick tour of some of the major Inca ruins in the country today. This is Cusco, again, the navel of the world, the capital of the Incas. Stonework is so magnificent. They revered stone almost as much as gold. Many men might work on a single stone for an entire year, chipping, hoisting, lowering, polishing, and so forth, so that they would create stone walls like this that were so tightly fitted that you could not slip a knife between the cracks of the stones. One of the most famous stones is the 12-angle stone. It's in Cusco. It's this stone right here, and it has 12 angles. Look at how intricate that was. Those stone workers must have been motivated by spiritual things in order to dedicate themselves to such provision and such hard and tedious work. Above Cusco are the ruins of Sacsayhuaman. We're not sure exactly what it was used for. At the end of the Inca Empire, it was used as a fortress by the Incas, but originally it was perhaps built for another purpose. As you can see, it's massive, and in fact it's the largest structure of interlocking stones held together without mortar or cement in the entire Western Hemisphere. Some of those stones weighed 100 tons, and so creating Sacsayhuaman involved virtually a great part of the empire to create that. And one of those stones apparently broke loose as they were moving it, and it rolled down the hill and killed 1,000 people. It was so large. Curicancha. Remember I said that Inti was the god of the sun? Well, Curicancha was the temple that they built to him. This is all that is left of it. The church of Santo Domingo was built by the Spaniards on the foundation of Curicancha. In fact, that was really a recurring theme. Wherever the Spaniards came into a major metropolitan area, they would destroy the old temple and build a church on top of it. And this particular temple was really quite remarkable. There were Spanish reports tell of its opulence that was fabulous beyond belief. It boasted an ornamental garden where everything, the clods of dirt, the maize plants, the corn cobs, were fashioned from silver and gold. Nearby grazed a flock of 20 golden llamas and their lambs, watched over by a solid gold shepherd. So it's really, really quite remarkable. Just a side note, this is an area of many earthquakes, and the Church of Santo Domingo has been destroyed a number of times over the years. The foundation was not touched by the earthquakes. It was so solid. Ollantaytambo was a town that was built by Pachacuti. This is where many of the people lived in the vicinity of Cusco, and as you can see, the ruins are really quite magnificent in many respects. Now, of course, the ruin that we are all familiar with is Machu Picchu. An assistant professor of Latin American history at Yale University was traveling in Peru, and he heard rumors of an Inca ghost town that had not been visited for over 400 years. He investigated those rumors and found a city that was untouched. This is, to my understanding, the only large city from pre-Columbian America that was not destroyed by the Spaniards. Why didn't they destroy it? They didn't even know it existed. It was a secret, a hidden city, way far from the areas where the Spaniards were located. And so Hiram Bingham, the name of this professor, investigated that city, and these are the pictures that he took that ended up in the National Geographic magazine. It inflamed the imagination of the world. And here's a picture of Hiram. Right there is Hiram. This guy looks familiar. I've seen him somewhere before, but I can't place the name. Hiram went up to Machu Picchu, and they cleaned away all of the vegetation and found it to be just an absolutely magnificent city. This is a graphical, a schematic layout of the city. I'm not going to take the time to talk about it, but as you can see by reading some of these, the titles up here: Noble Houses, Royal Tomb, House of the Guards, various temples. Just a magnificently preserved place. There is no place in the entire world like Machu Picchu. And one of the very most special places is the sacred rock. It is called Intihuatana. It's the sun's hitching post. Basically, the Inca felt like they needed to have some way to keep the sun from leaving. They wanted to hitch it with a rope. And so this was the hitching post, and if they hitched the sun, it would come back again, and they would be able to grow their crops. Now, according to legend and perhaps experience of some people today, if you touch the rock, you will feel a very intense spiritual power. And in fact, the powerful vibrations that emanate from that rock enable people to continue their journey in peace and safety. And in about 3 days from now, Marianne and I will be, 4 days from now, Marianne and I will be touching that rock and thinking of you and wishing that your journey will continue in peace and safety. I would like to conclude this last lecture by giving you an old Irish blessing. Let me try and remember it. I'm not good with memory. I'm gonna, after all, short-term memory has never been my strength. May the road rise up to meet you. May the sun always be behind you. May the sun's warmth May the sun shine, warm your face, and the rain fall soft upon your fields. And until we meet again, may God hold you in the palm of his hand. Thank you.